Unveiling the path of courage, walking with Christ to the cross and beyond. I want to welcome you back with a heartfelt sense of anticipation. Because the portion of Matthew's Gospel we're about to step into is where the stakes get higher. The challenge is deeper. And the lessons more transformative. We ended our last conversation at a pivotal moment. Reflecting on how the teachings and miracles of Jesus set the stage for the most profound events yet to come. We explored the Beatitudes, the parables of the kingdom, and the radical love that compels us to see every person through the lens of compassion. But as the narrative of Matthew continues, we find ourselves walking alongside Jesus in his final days, a journey marked by courage, betrayal, and a promise that, if we accept it, can shake us at our core and reshape how we understand faith. Take a moment to imagine Jesus and his disciples during the time leading up to the Passover. The group must have sensed the tension building around them. The religious elites were increasingly threatened by Jesus's influence and the hope he inspired in the common folk. Rumors filled the air. Was he truly the promised Messiah? Or was he just another pretender who would ultimately fail? And where would all this lead? Now, it's all too easy for us, looking back through history, to see these events as inevitable. But for the disciples, every new day might have felt like stepping into unknown territory. Perhaps you can relate, moments in your life when everything seemed on the brink, and you didn't know whether breakthrough or disaster awaited. In these climactic chapters of Matthew, the plot accelerates around the feast of the Passover, a holy time that remembered Israel's liberation from slavery in Egypt. In a fitting parallel, Jesus is about to perform an act that symbolizes the ultimate liberation, not just from a foreign oppressor, but from the chains of sin and death itself. He gathers his disciples for what we now call the Last Supper. Picture the scene, an intimate room, dimly lit by flickering oil lamps. The hush of solemnity in the air, and the knowledge that something weighty is about to happen. Jesus takes bread, gives thanks, breaks it, and says, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he takes the cup of wine, drink from it, all of you. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. At that moment, he establishes a new kind of covenant, a renewed promise that God is with us, even if we haven't fully grasped the magnitude of that reality. Have you ever stopped to consider the vulnerability in that moment? The sense of impending sacrifice that Jesus himself must have felt. He knew that one of his own would betray him. Yet he still offered bread and wine as a symbol of his total self-giving. It's a sobering reminder that genuine love does not shrink back when faced with the risk of heartbreak or betrayal. It moves forward, willing to pay whatever price necessary for the redemption of others. In a way, this kind of love challenges us to the very depths. How often do we hold back from loving someone because we fear being hurt? Are we willing to love even those who might turn against us? That is a haunting question. In Matthew's narrative, the gravity of this supper foreshadows the greatest act of love the world has ever known. From the upper room, the story transitions to the Garden of Gethsemane, one of the most emotionally charged moments in the entire Gospel. Here, Jesus withdraws with his closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, to pray in the stillness of night. He asks them to keep watch, to remain awake and vigilant. But the disciples, worn by fatigue and perhaps weighed down by emotional turmoil, cannot stay awake for even an hour. Meanwhile, Jesus wrestles in prayer, expressing a depth of anguish so intense that Matthew describes his sweat falling like drops of blood. He pleads, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Here, In the darkness of Gethsemane, we see Jesus in his most human moment, filled with sorrow, aware of the pain he's about to endure, and yet still surrendering to God's plan. The vulnerability in Gethsemane resonates with anyone who has faced a seemingly impossible trial and prayed desperately for a way out. Perhaps you've been there, staring at a bleak medical diagnosis, wrestling with the heartbreak of a severed relationship, or facing a challenge that defies your sense of survival. In that tension, we find one of the most startling elements of Jesus' prayer. He's honest with God about his dread. Yet he ultimately chooses obedience over self-preservation. This reveals a hidden dimension of true faith. So often, we assume faith means the absence of doubt or fear. But Jesus models something different. Faith means forging ahead even when fear lingers, trusting that God's purpose is bigger than our present turmoil. Have you ever considered that perhaps your struggles could be molding you into a person who embodies hope for others? Even if you can't quite see it now. Out of the shadows, Judas arrives, leading a small army of armed men. He greets Jesus with a kiss, the signal of betrayal that would echo through all of history. The disciples, startled, consider fighting back. One even takes a sword and cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant. But Jesus stops them. Put your sword back into its place. For all who take the sword will perish by the sword. In that moment, Jesus rejects the way of violence, embodying the teachings he had preached in the Sermon on the Mount. He had told his followers to love their enemies, to pray for those who persecute them. And here in the garden, he lives it out to the letter. His arrest is a demonstration of his willing submission to the path he has chosen. It's also a challenging moment for us, provoking us to question our own instincts. Do we respond to conflict by lashing out? Or do we trust that love's power is ultimately stronger than violence? That question slices through our modern hearts just as acutely as it did for the disciples. Jesus is then taken before the high priest, where he faces an unjust trial. False witnesses come forward, twisting his words. Religious leaders spit accusations at him. Consider the irony. The very people charged with upholding God's law are now perverting it to condemn an innocent man. The tension in Matthew's gospel heightens as we see corruption and fear driving the actions of people who should have recognized God's presence among them. It's a sobering reminder that sometimes the greatest obstacles to truth can be found within religious or institutional establishments. How often have we seen individuals or systems that claim to represent righteousness, yet act out of self-preservation or fear? And perhaps the deeper question for us is, when do we do the same on a personal level? Justifying our own wrongdoing instead of facing the truth? Meanwhile, Peter, who had earlier declared he would never deny Jesus, finds himself overwhelmed by fear. Outside in the courtyard, people recognize him as one of Jesus's followers. Confronted with these accusations, Peter denies knowing Jesus 3 times, exactly as Jesus had predicted. At the moment the rooster crows, Peter is struck with the realization of his own failure, and he weeps bitterly. This is a profoundly human moment. Who among us hasn't made a promise we couldn't keep, or stood firm in theory, only to crumble under pressure? Yet Peter's failure becomes a pathway to transformation later on. He doesn't remain in denial or despair. Instead, he returns to Jesus after the resurrection, ultimately becoming a foundational leader for the early church. Maybe you've had times in life when you let someone down, or you failed to uphold your best intentions. Take heart in Peter's story. Even the greatest failures can lead to redemption when met with humility and grace. As the drama continues, Jesus is brought before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who holds the power to sentence him. Pilate vacillates between recognizing Jesus' innocence and fearing the uproar of the crowds who demand crucifixion. To quell the unrest, Pilate ultimately yields to the crowd's pressure, sentencing Jesus to death. Here we see how collective fear and mob mentality can push a leader to commit an act of injustice rather than risk losing political favor. If we reflect on modern times, we may notice parallels in how public opinion can shift with alarming speed, sometimes overshadowing moral conviction. The question for us becomes, do we have the courage to stand for what is right, even if it means standing alone? The crucifixion scene in Matthew is stark and raw. Jesus is mocked, flogged, and forced to carry his cross to Golgotha. Soldiers place a crown of thorns on his head, sarcastically calling him the King of the Jews. Spectators hurl insults, saying, "If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." In these final moments, we see the complete self-giving of Jesus. He endures not just physical agony but the emotional and spiritual weight of humanity's brokenness. We can barely comprehend the magnitude of this suffering. But one phrase from the cross stands out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Quoting Psalm 22. Jesus exposes the crushing sense of abandonment he feels, a reality that resonates with anyone who's ever felt utterly alone in a time of crisis. Perhaps you've questioned why God seemed silent in your darkest hour. Even Jesus knows the gravity of that question. Shortly thereafter, Jesus breathes his last. The temple curtain tears from top to bottom. The earth quakes. And for a moment, creation itself seems to cry out in anguish. To the disciples, it must have felt like absolute defeat. Their beloved teacher, the one they believed was the Messiah, is dead. In that moment, despair would have overshadowed any hope. But we, from our vantage point, know that this is not the end. In fact, in the paradoxical wisdom of God, this apparent defeat paves the way for the greatest victory. Yet it's important to pause here and acknowledge the weight of the crucifixion. Sometimes, in our eagerness to jump to resurrection, we skip over the suffering. But walking with Christ includes acknowledging the pain, the loss, and the sorrow. There is deep meaning in recognizing that God entered fully into our human experience, including our suffering. Here, I want to pose a question that might penetrate to the core of your faith or worldview. How might your outlook on suffering change if you believed there was a God who not only saw your pain, but willingly walked through unimaginable anguish on your behalf? It's a radical notion, one that can alter how we process our darkest experiences. Instead of viewing suffering as evidence of God's absence, the crucifixion suggests that God intimately understands our pain. This perspective doesn't trivialize our suffering, rather, it places it in the context of a divine story that leads to renewal and hope. Let's not forget the extraordinary moment following the crucifixion when a Roman centurion, having witnessed the manner in which Jesus died, exclaims, "Truly this was the Son of God." Think about it, a hardened soldier, part of the machinery of Rome, is moved to recognize the divinity in the very man his regiment just crucified. This is a testament to the mysterious, transformative power of Jesus' sacrificial love. Sometimes the greatest evidence of divine reality comes in the wake of suffering. In the face of such love, even the hardest hearts can be moved. Have you encountered situations where an unexplainable peace or a surprising act of kindness changed your perspective so dramatically that you had to reconsider your assumptions? Such moments are akin to the centurion's revelation, a direct confrontation with a truth that transcends our usual ways of thinking. The immediate aftermath of the crucifixion is permeated by silence. Jesus' body is laid in a tomb, sealed with a stone, and guarded by soldiers. For many, it must have seemed like the end of a dream. The disciples likely found themselves huddled in fear and doubt, wondering if the past 3 years of following Jesus had come to a devastating conclusion. Maybe this resonates with a season in your life when all your hopes seemed dead and buried, and a cold finality snuffed out any optimism you once had. But in the hidden space of that tomb, a miracle is about to unfold. Death does not get the final word. And that, in essence, is the heart of Christian faith. Before we move on to the resurrection itself, let's pause to reflect on how all of this relates to our modern stories. We see betrayal, injustice, fear, and heartbreak set against a backdrop of unconditional love and unwavering commitment. We see the moral courage of Jesus standing in stark contrast to the self-preserving choices of the religious leaders and the fearful decisions of Pontius Pilate. We see a friend's denial, a lover's grief, the mocking crowd, and a soldier's epiphany. It's as though the entire spectrum of human experience, our sin and our glory, our failure and our potential, is placed under a divine magnifying glass. That's the breathtaking power of the Gospel of Matthew. There's also a practical dimension here. If Jesus's teachings are simply lofty ideals, they might inspire us momentarily. But real transformation demands something deeper. We witness Jesus living out those teachings, forgiving those who put him to death, refusing to respond to violence with violence, loving without limit. The question that hovers in the background is, can we do the same in our sphere of life? However small or large that may be. Consider your own day-to-day struggles, whether it's conflicts at work, tension with family, or an internal battle with anxiety or shame. The events leading to the cross demonstrate a faith that does more than speak words. It acts in the face of adversity. It's a living faith that stands firm even when the outcome is uncertain. As we transition to the resurrection, it's crucial to understand that the power of Easter morning is directly linked to the suffering of Good Friday. The darkness, despair, and apparent defeat make the dawn of resurrection a hope that breaks every previously held assumption. If the cross shows us how far love is willing to go, then the empty tomb shows us what that love is capable of achieving: life that transcends death, hope that conquers fear, and a new beginning where we once only saw an end. This is the turning point that has reverberated through history, sparking countless acts of faith, sacrifice, and renewal. It's why, more than 2,000 years later, we're still drawn to these pages of Matthew's Gospel, still compelled by a love so potent it can reform hearts, societies, and the trajectory of the entire world. Maybe right now you're in a place of anticipation or longing for a breakthrough. You've carried your own crosses, faced your own dark nights, and wondered if there's any possibility of redemption on the other side. The message of the gospel is that there is. And it's not just a sentimental hope, but one grounded in the life, death, and resurrection of a real historical figure, whose impact has ignited faith across countless generations. To fully appreciate this cosmic shift, we need to approach the resurrection not just as a theological idea, but as an encounter that has the power to transform us, just as it transformed the fearful disciples into bold witnesses who changed the world. So, if you find your heart stirring at the thought of a hope that outlasts despair, I encourage you to continue on this journey with me. We'll step into Matthew's account of the resurrection, witnessing how Jesus appears to the women at the tomb, to his startled disciples, and ultimately commissions them to carry the message of good news to the ends of the earth. In these coming passages, we see love's triumph. And in that triumph, we find a blueprint for our own transformation, a call to live differently, love more fiercely, And trust that in God's hands, even our darkest days can become the seedbed for astonishing miracles. But let me pose a challenge. One that might reach into the hidden corners of your spirit. Are you prepared to let the reality of the crucifixion and resurrection disrupt the status quo of your life? Because to embrace this story fully is to let it reshape how you think, how you love, how you respond to injustice, and how you see yourself and others. It means relinquishing control and trusting that there's a higher purpose guiding your existence. That's not easy. But if this gospel is true, then it might be the most significant step you could ever take. So, ask yourself, if God's love is powerful enough to conquer death, could it also be powerful enough to breathe new life into your own fears, doubts, and wounds? In this second part of our journey through the Gospel of Matthew, we've ventured through scenes that reveal the intensity of Jesus' final days, his Last Supper, the anguish in Gethsemane, the trial before the high priest and Pilate, the denial by a close friend, and the grim reality of the crucifixion. We've examined how these events, though specific to a historical time, resonate with modern struggles, confronting us with questions about love, sacrifice, betrayal, and courage. We've glimpsed how faith isn't just an escape from suffering but a path that goes straight through it, guided by a love willing to endure the ultimate cost. And we're on the cusp of discovering that the story does not end with a sealed tomb. In the next part, we'll witness the culminating event that changed the entire framework of human history, the resurrection. We'll see how Jesus' return to life ushers in a new age, providing fresh hope for all who dare to believe and setting the stage for the spread of his message across continents and centuries. If you're ready to see how this narrative reaches its soaring conclusion, and how it might change your own story, then get ready for the next step in this epic journey. The best part is on its way, and I can't wait to share it with you. Stay tuned for what comes next in the Gospel of Matthew as we explore the mysterious dawn that followed the darkest night. Through those resurrection encounters, we'll learn that hope is more than just a concept, it's a force that can flip the script of our entire existence. Whether you come from a background of faith or skepticism, you owe it to yourself to at least hear the conclusion of this astonishing story. Let's walk that path together.